If you've ever heard a Google ringtone, then you know the work of Google sound design lead Conor O'Sullivan.
The default ringtone on Pixel 2, for example, was actually a notification in the beginning. And then I started to play with repetition for that sound. The difference between a notification and a ringtone sometimes could be as simple as repetition.
Welcome to the Method Podcast, where we explore the design stories behind Google products and experiences. You've probably noticed that I am not Aidan Simpson. Aidan has moved on to some cool new projects, and he's handed the Method baton to me. I'm Travis Nilsson, I design search here at Google, and I'm also Method's new host. But before Aidan left, he sat down with Conor at a piano in Mountain View to dive into the nuances of sound design and talk through the choices that shape everything from notification pings to haptic feedback and skeuomorphic sound. So, here's Conor.
I've been at Google for about 2.5 years. I lead up sound design for Google's P&E, which is platform and ecosystems. Essentially, that means I work on things like Android platform, some of our products like Pixel, Home, as well as looking at how design language works at Google and what that means for sound.
What is hard about what you do?
Well, I think one thing that's particularly challenging is, when people think about sound, they tend to think of it as something that can be perceived as annoying or invasive. If you're watching a film or if you're playing a game, you absolutely want to hear a lot of sound, as much sound as possible. But from a product designer's perspective, when it comes to sound, it's almost like the opposite. You really don't want to hear a lot of sound a lot of the time. And so that poses an interesting design challenge, which is how do you provide something to a user and to a listener that's functional, but doesn't really get in their way a lot of the time? And that's probably one of the hardest things that I have to do as a sound designer, is play sounds for people that don't necessarily always want to hear sound, or that don't want to at least notice those sounds all the time.
So it's being respectful.
Exactly, yeah. You absolutely need to be respectful of the user, of their choices, of the context in which they're in, sometimes the physical environment that they're in. And you need to play sound in an appropriate way that is respectful.
Thing that springs to mind is notifications. That's something that you're going to hear multiple times a day. What kind of methods or sound design techniques do you employ to ensure that you are being respectful of the users?
Especially when it comes to things like ringtones or notifications. Some people like things that are going to, no matter where they are, they want to be interrupted and they want the sound to play as loud as possible. So we need to provide some options that are like that. On the other hand, sometimes I talk to people that say, well, I do want my phone to alert me, especially if I'm away from the phone. But, I wanted to cover all cases where I might be in a meeting, so I wanted to start out really gently and quiet. We try to provide a range of options for users so that we meet some of those stylistic demands. And one way to do that is to look at the arc of the sound. So even if it's a ringtone, ringtones tend to be about 20 seconds in duration, because that's roughly the length of time it takes for the carrier's voicemail to kick in. Even over an arc as short as 20 seconds, you can create a little bit of a story there. So like a gentle introduction followed by something that maybe doubles up. It might start here and then it goes up the octave. Because the higher in the frequency spectrum you go, the better the sound tends to be at grabbing your attention, particularly in noisier environments. You also increase the types of contrasting sounds and rhythms that you're presenting to the user. In other words, things that are changing sonically to get the ear's attention. Even in something as short as a 20-second ringtone, you can tell a little bit of a story, increase some complexity, and hopefully, do the job of the ringtone, while also, of course, performing the other job, which is saying something about the product and the experience as well.
As a sound designer, you have to be super aware of a user's context at all times as well.
Yeah, that's key. I mean, any sound designer that's thinking about designing a sound for an experience is to really understand how the user is going to hear this sound, where they're going to hear it, what type of user is going to hear it. And really get into the details of the context so that you can design a sound that's most appropriate for that particular environment, also for that product. One important step when it comes to creating sounds is the sound optimization process. After you've gone through the whole design process, you'll really need to audition the sound in the product and hear it as the user is going to hear it. It's things like altering some of the frequency characteristics and maybe EQing the sound so that it works a bit better on the speaker. On a Pixel or any phone really, for example, you don't hear a lot of sounds at the very low end. So we tend to design higher up in the frequency spectrum for mobile phone sounds.
I'm drawing parallels between what we do on mobile app design and what you do on sound design. So
Yes.
You're designing sound specifically for those smaller speakers and also the environment that the user is in.
Yeah, and that presents, lots of challenges. First of all, you don't have the broad palette of sound to choose from when you're just initially designing a sound. So while you might have great sounds that you've recorded or instruments to play or libraries that you're using, you can't necessarily use all those to design a sound for a mobile phone.
Ringtones are they're a very clever way for our users to express themselves. I think about on the Pixel phone, you have that ringtone, which I think is somebody saying the word ring.
Yeah.
Ring, 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 ring.
Yeah, that was really fun. I actually worked with the voice of the Google Assistant.
Oh, right, Holly.
Yes, Holly. And we just spent about an hour in the studio one day playing around with different sounds and vocalizations and utterances, because I thought it would be a fun design exercise to take her voice in different contexts and see would there be anything interesting I could do, both in terms of the timbre of the voice and also the spectral qualities of the voice, and see if there's ways I can reflect that in sound. One of the kind of joking sounds she suggested was the ring ring type sounds. It's one of those things that as soon as people heard it, they just started laughing, and it was something that we kind of had to put into the product. But I've gotten some great feedback from people that they really thought it was a really fun way to express the brand, and they thought that it was well done.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about is vibration and sound and how you use that in the device. And how do you think about using kind of other senses when it comes to the sound design process?
If you think about product design, the way it's evolved over the years, the amount of information that we're trying to convey to users has become increasingly complex. And to a large degree, the means in which we're doing it over screens, they tend to become smaller and smaller. We go from a computer down to a tablet or to a mobile device. So there's only a limited amount of things that you can do visually to give information to the user. So I think that product designers have a real opportunity when it comes to providing feedback to users to look towards the other senses, sound being a big part of that. But I also do include haptic feedback as part of that kind of sensory design. These things always really work well when they're orchestrated and coordinated together, and when you design from the start thinking about them all as cohesive experiences. When people do engage with good quality haptic feedback, and then maybe for whatever reason their settings change or they have changed it themselves and turned it off, they tend to miss it. And that's something that I think is a good indicator of both good sound design and good haptic design, is that they don't necessarily notice it in all cases. It doesn't always have to stand out. Like if a user is scrolling through a list, for example, and they hear a very subtle sound that indicates they're moving to the next item, maybe they feel a gentle bump when they've hit the end of the list. Those are two examples of how you might coordinate feedback. And hopefully, if it's designed right, the user won't really think too much about that. And it'll just become part of the overall fabric and the overall experience of engaging with that product. But if you were then to take that away, they'll miss that. I think that's a good indicator that that feedback is really working well in that context.
You mentioned an interesting thing there, so users don't even notice these things. Is that the goal of sound design almost?
When it comes to UX sound for product design, yes, I do think a lot of the times your goal as a sound designer is to provide feedback to a user that doesn't jump out too much. And it sounds very counterintuitive, you're designing sound that you don't want to be heard. But a lot of the cases, it makes sense. There are, of course, exceptions to that. So when you want to get a user's attention, you should play a sound that performs that task and does it well. And there's also cases where the sound should just feel like it's working well as part of the overall system. And if a user doesn't really notice it, that's okay, because I guarantee you they will notice it if it's a bad sound.
You and your team designed the sound for Pixel and Pixel 2. Sound is a big part of kind of designing a brand for a phone. What considerations do you have when thinking about sound in a big kind of brand context like that?
Yeah, I really think about creating sound like that as creating a soundscape. So you want to be able to tell a story from end to end, no matter where a user is engaging with sound as part of your product, your brand, your product experience. You want to be telling the same story from a sound design perspective. So you want to make sure that sounds sound like they all belong to the same family or the same orchestra, however you want to think about it. You're designing sounds that in all cases are telling you something, because you really shouldn't play a sound just to play a sound. A sound should always have a good functional reason to play. But there's also a difference in how and when the user hears that sound, and the prominence and the placement of the sound will tell you different things about the brand. So no matter when you're hearing the sound will tell you something, but it's also telling you something about the brand.
One good example of that is the boot up sound for Pixel. Mm-hmm. Just wondering if you could talk us through the process of how you went from beginning to end there. I think about Google's brand as something as quite simple and modern, and like how did you reflect that in the sound design?
Exactly, yeah, and really having a good exploration and understanding of the brand was key to trying to nail down that sound. So here's one, for example, that also involved the piano. That was just kind of like a little playful note that something's happening, which I thought was a nice representation of the brand. I also looked at the voice, so you can hear it with that one. There's kind of an inference of Google there, but it's not exactly saying Google.
Were these explorations just you putting sonic notes on a page almost to kind of see how you felt about them?
Exactly, yeah. Just trying to tease out, well, what are really the principles of the brand that reflect strongest in the sound? And how can we play a sound that's a good representation of the brand? So as part of this process, we started to converge a little bit more on the piano sounds. I believe these were the final 4 directions that we looked at. So that's a short little melody, a single note. And that's the chord that you actually hear in the final version. So this is the final version of the sound. So on the piano, it's very simple. Just 2 Gs resolving to a chord of G. The animation that you see on the Pixel when it boots up resolves to a visual G. We thought it'd be nice to use the note and chord of G on the piano. And I think the piano, was a nice timbre to end up with to represent this part of the Google brand. There's a natural element to it too, but it's also presented in a clean, modern way. And I think that that's what the Google brand tends to represent for a lot of people.
And so how did that brand presence kind of follow through onto the ringtones?
So it had an impact in a number of different ways. Similarly to how we might approach designing any sound or a brand sound, having a good understanding of what the design principles are going to be central to the experience and to the ultimate sound. So having something that's like fun and upbeat for ringtones sometimes makes a lot of sense, but still reflects some of those simpler, cleaner values of the Google brand. So that's something that I did as part of the default ringtone on Pixel 2, for example, which we call the Big Adventure. When I originally started out with that sound, it was actually a notification in the beginning. So it was quite a short sound. So just a little chordal run. Then I started to play with that idea a little bit and think about it in different orchestrations. So not just on piano, but with different instruments playing. And then I started to play with repetition for that sound. The difference between a notification and a ringtone sometimes could be as simple as repetition. So I started to thematically develop a little bit. This was a 4th evolution. And musically, it's quite simple. You're just moving from a G chord, again, the G rearing its head, to the relative minor to E minor. The lower note, the kind of bass note, is a B, which is a common note between those two chords, but it's not necessarily an expected bass note when you think about G and E. So it gives it a little bit of tension and kind of conveys the idea that there's movement happening and kind of a sense of urgency, which is what you want to convey with a ringtone. And I can actually play the
play the
where we
final one.
ended up with the final sound.
Could you play the very first iteration again? Just that chord run that you had?
So just from that run of notes, playing around with it, exploring the timbres, the textures, repetition, the arc of the over 20 seconds, we get to something that kind of ended up in a really nice place. And just a quick note on the name, The Big Adventure. So we have a team of writers, the UX content team, and they're absolutely awesome at naming our ringtones. I don't know how they do it, but they nail the essence and they really, capture the feeling of the sound. Like we have our default notification sound as well, which we call popcorn. I think that's such an awesome name for that sound because it's like if you were to imagine what popcorn sounded like musically, you'd pick something like that. But even that one actually went through an evolution. So popcorn started out as something a little bit longer. While it worked as a notification and there was definitely a playful aspect to it, I think to be used as a default sound, it needed to be made a little bit shorter and a little bit more iconic, because as a longer sound, it doesn't really work for everyone, to cover a wide range of stylistic preferences for a default notification.
This might be a slightly naive question, but in the beginning, we kind of started talking about the piano and simplistically how that kind of resonates with the Google brand, but then these sounds seem to have kind of moved away from that. How do you make sure that you stay within the soundscape?
I think it's really important to provide enough variety that users are interested and engaged with the product. But even while you do that, you can also do that in such a way that the sounds are still part of a family. They still feel like they belong together and they work well together. One way we do that here is that we're using either sounds that are natural acoustic instruments, natural sounds, or even some synthesized sounds that feel like they behave in a way that's similar to how an acoustic instrument might behave. So while we can certainly explore different timbres, different sonic styles, it's still within the bounds and guidelines of what best represents our brand principles and how that translates into sound.
How did you find sound design?
I've always been interested in sound and music. From a very young age, I learned piano by ear, so I kind of picked up melodies and things myself.
How did you have the opportunity to pick up those?
There's music in my family. We always had a piano in the house at home. Both sides of my family have musical backgrounds, so I think I was exposed to it from an early age. And then I did learn the more classical method and was trained, quote unquote, properly that way. As part of my undergrad, I took music and mathematics, so I studied both of those things, which are actually fairly well related, and sound can be quite technical and mathematical. Music also is, a lot of it is about ratios and harmonies and things that have a relationship to one another.
So one really kind of influenced the other in some respects?
Yes, they complement each other, I think. It's not unusual to find people who are interested in both mathematics and music. It might be more common than people think. As part of my master's degree program, I became a little bit more exposed to the idea of sound as part of user experience and the important role it has to play there.
Was there a particular project or pivotal moment where that introduced you to those two things?
I think the whole curriculum was really geared towards a good understanding of user experience, and one of the sister programs in the department that I did my music technology master's in was interactive media. So they were also, a lot of times focused on things like user experience, and as a result, I was getting exposed to that. After that, I then worked at Motorola, and I was at Motorola at a really exciting time in their history when they released products like the Razr phone. So I worked on all the ringtones that people heard for Razr, like the Hello Moto ringtone, for example.
Hello Moto.
And that was great time to be working there and really exciting. After that then, I worked at Xbox. So I worked on platform sound design. So basically anytime you heard a sound that was representative of the Xbox platform, or if you're engaging with the dashboard and things like that, that was all stuff that I worked on. That was before I came to Google.
Final question. What is your favorite song?
I haven't written it yet.
Oh, good answer. Conor, thank you so much for your time. This has been great.
Thank you.
Hey there, this is Travis again, just jumping in to say that you can find more information on Conor and his work in the show notes at design.google/podcasts. This episode was produced by Barbara Eldridge. The artwork you see for each episode is created by Skip Hirsch, and the scheduling is handled by Becca Tollefson. Subscribe to the show on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like this episode, please leave a review. It really helps new listeners to find the show. All right, that's it from us.